The four Gospels that have been accepted into the canon of the Bible are Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. It is an oft-made statement by Islamic apologists that we don't know who wrote the Gospels, and that argument is put forward in a way to imply that we should reject them as trustworthy documents. They conveniently forget that it is not in knowing who the author is that is important, but is it the truth? All that being said, we are pretty confident though that we know who the authors are for each of the four Gospels. Critical arguments about authorship of the Gospels revolve around the same data and have revolved around it for a long time. This is relevant because we see the same arguments coming up time and time again. Muslims often present their case like they are the only ones to have ever used that data, as though they of all the critics are the only ones to see it, and yet the Church has answered these arguments successfully for hundreds of years and likely 2,000 years. Anyway, putting that aside, let's have a look at the evidence. There is strong evidence for the authorship of the Gospels of John and Luke actually held within the pages of these two books, but also we find evidence to the authorship of not just those two Gospels, but also Mark and Matthew from the traditions of the early Church. Now, to my scientific mind, tradition is not my preferred form of evidence, but evidence it is nevertheless. So the onus is on anyone who wants to challenge that to come up with counter evidence. Let us delve into that further. If the authors of the four Gospels are not known, then why is it there are no other traditions for the authors? For example, the 2nd century witness is in agreement that the four Gospels were written by the same authors that we recognise as being the authors today. This tells us that they received their titles very early on, therefore the issue was settled. If not, then speculation would have abounded to whom the authors were, and a number of different people would have been put forward. It is beyond belief that no one knew who the true authors were for decades, and then managed to apply authorship and managed to get agreement across the whole Roman Empire. At the beginning of the 2nd century, there would have been first generation Christians alive who recalled the apostles and their teachings. And many more 2nd generation Christians also would have been alive who would have had information passed directly to them. That being so, how could anyone have dared to attribute the Gospels to anyone other than the genuine authors, with his 1st and 2nd generation witnesses still alive? All this is strong evidence that the authors were known right at the beginning of the Gospels being written, and also it's highly likely that the actual documents carried the author's name as a title. If the authors were made up, then why did the early church choose such unlikely characters as authors? For example, Luke is mentioned only a few times by name in the New Testament and is hardly what you would call one of the big hitters. Mark abandoned Paul on one of his journeys, and you can read that in Acts 15. Mark and Luke were not eyewitnesses, so you would not expect them to be the first names to come to mind to choose as authors. Matthew was an apostle, but he was also a tax collector, and no one likes a tax man. Out of the four Gospels, John is the only logical choice if you wanted to apply a name to an anonymous Gospel. Why would they choose Matthew, Mark and Luke when they could use the so-called big hitters, such as Peter, for example, or maybe James, the brother of Jesus, or why not even Paul? Now here is a very good question to finish on. If the original Gospels were anonymous and a person or persons felt the urge to add an author to add to the authority of the Gospels, then why didn't anyone think to just add the name of Jesus as the author? His name certainly would have added the required authority. Now there may be reasons that you may not want to do this, other than the fact it's dishonest, but a reason may be that you might answer, yes, but the Gospels refer to Jesus in third person. This is very true, but if someone was prepared to deceive to this extent, then the next step would be to edit whichever Gospel they'd selected and to change it from third person to first person. The fact that none of this happened or was even possible is further evidence that the original authors were already established at an early date. So again, thank you for listening. Please feel free to comment below, and as always, may God bless you in your search for the truth.